Hello everyone, welcome back to the Analyst for 27th of May 2024, where we will be discussing 9 most important articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express. The very first article is on the specter of nuclear agreements and also about the global nuclear order. In the next one, we'll be looking at inflation, trade and the various aspects within the Indian agriculture. In the third one, we'll be looking at LVM3 and the commercialization of the same via ISRO. In the fourth one, we'll be looking at AI Convention, which is also popularly known as European Union's AI Convention. And in the fifth one, we'll be looking at PM JANMAN scheme, which is a very important scheme for the tribal sections of the population. In the final part, we'll be looking at 4 more important prelims-centric articles because we know prelims is upcoming soon. And that is why we need to also cover the news in shorts for our prelims examination. So stay tuned. So students, the very first article today is on nuclear conflict and the global nuclear order. And this is a very important article by M.K. Narayan, who was actually the former IB chief of India. And here we have to understand that nuclear conflict, nuclear wars, nuclear weapons are always in the news, and that is why you have to look at it very closely. Firstly, from prelims perspective, because we have the current events of national and international importance here, and in GS2 we also have the effects on politics of various developed and developing countries around the world on India's interest. And here the nuclear order, the nuclear concepts are very important within the scene. Now here, before understanding one thing, let us understand a very simple illustration. Imagine that there is a small village, and within this village there are 5 friends, right? Now these 5 friends, let us imagine, are small children, and each of the children would want to have more power with respect to the other friends, right? So that is why maybe once upon a time, one day, a child procured an AK-47. Right? Now you obviously will understand this particular child 1 will be more powerful than the other 4 children, right? Because simply he has a gun. Now here what will be happening to the other 4 individuals or other 4 children? So they will be also wanting to possess a similar gun or say a greater gun with greater capabilities, right? So this is the same thing with the nuclear world as of now or with our present world. There are some countries in the world which have nuclear weapons. There are some other countries which do not. And also this has been the trend which has been varying, particularly after the end of the World War II. Now let us understand the context in the same. Just as in our example, every children would want that AK-47. Right? Everyone would be wanting to have more power and influence over them, because simply power with one is not an equal, say, representation with reference to the power with the others. And here we have to understand, before going into the main discussion, some key terms which are actually used often, frequently in the discourse when we talk about the global nuclear order. Now the very first term is obviously about the nuclear weapons. When we talk about nuclear weapons, we talk about weapons that have the capability of mass destructions. We are very familiar with the nuclear weapons and how they operate, the very science of nuclear weapons have also been covered in the previous analyzations. So here we will be looking mainly into the geopolitical and the geoeconomic aspects of the scene. Now here when we talk about nuclear weapons, we can see, right, at this particular map here, when we talk about nuclear weapons and the countries or the states with nuclear weapons, we understand the first country when we try to compare within the same will be always US and Russia. They have the highest number or the number of stockpile of nuclear weapons in their countries. This is followed by China, France, United Kingdom, Pakistan and India, which are also following on the ranking in the same. Now also as we look at into this particular diagram here, over a particular period of time, particularly if we look at CIPRI data, which is actually a global repository of data on military expenditure, and also we are talking about nuclear military expenditure here. If you look at these particular years of 2021 and 2023, we find that the global expenditure by various countries on nuclear weapons have also increased. And here we also come across a very important term known as nuclear deterrence. Just as in our example, the various children in this particular village would want right? AK-47s, because they want to firstly have more power. Secondly, they want to also make themselves and also their family secure. So that is why having weapons or having the capabilities of nuclear weapons is actually another form of deterrence. Now, deterrence is what? If you have a nuclear weapon in your country, maybe your neighbor who also has a nuclear weapon will not be readily attacking on you. Why? Because if they attack on you with nuclear weapons, you will be also retaliating with nuclear weapons. So obviously we can understand that destruction will be mass, right? So that is why having nuclear deterrence is also very, very important for countries. Next, when we talk about nuclear weapons, and also we know nuclear weapons is actually finally derived from nuclear or radioactive materials such as uranium and so on. So the distribution, production of uranium, the distribution and production of various nuclear sensitive capabilities such as nuclear technologies, right? They can also flow freely between the countries. So maybe there is one developed country such as the US. They would want to say, for example, export their nuclear weapons to other countries because they will be having more and more profit. But here we have to understand the proliferation of the spread of nuclear weapons is equally dangerous to the rest of the global community also, because there will be now new countries who will be getting the nuclear weapons and they will be now posing threats. So that is why in nuclear discourse, in nuclear in global nuclear discussions, this arms control is another very, very important term. In the next one, we are talking about non-proliferation. Now see, the term proliferation, obviously, if we go by the meaning of it, it generally is signifying the spread of this particular nuclear technology to rest of the to rest of the global community. And when we talk about nuclear weapon, this is not actually something that we should be sharing with other countries, because we have to obviously understand nuclear weapon in itself is a destruction, is a weapon of mass destruction, and it is not like nuclear energy. It is not like, say, other kind of, say, green energies and so on, of which the technologies can easily flow between various countries. We are talking here about weapons, right? So that is why when we talk about nuclear weapons, there should be also non-proliferation of the same. And finally, when we talk about the states or the countries who already have nuclear weapons, such as these countries, right, there should be a particular future, right, say 50, 100 years from now on, where they should not be having any nuclear weapons, because even one nuclear weapon with one country is actually a threat to other individuals in the other nations and so on. So that is why we have to understand having even one nuclear weapon with any country is equally dangerous as having 100 and 200 and so on. So that is why maybe in the near future, right, according to various global discourses and the discussions on nuclear weapons and so on, there is actually a future where there should be no nuclear weapons with everyone, and this term is actually known as nuclear disarmament. And after we are having acquainted with the various terms here, we are in a position to go on to the particular agreements and the conventions on the nuclear front here. Now, this particular debate on the nuclear front is actually starting from the Cold War, when the US and the USSR was embroiled in this particular Cold War, and one of the main center stages was the use, or say the potential use, of nuclear weapons in this particular conflict. And this actually became a very, very serious one in 1962 after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia was actually alleged to have supplied nuclear arms and dealers and weapons to the state of Cuba, which was just around, say, 100-200 nautical miles away from the coast of USA, that is Florida. So here it was alleged that Russia actually supplied nuclear arms and weapons, and that is when the global community became very, very cautious, very, very careful, and two things came out of it the same. The first thing is that the world needs bilateral mechanisms to curb the spread of nuclear weapons, because here, whenever there will be two powers, three powers, these are major global powers, they will be always at conflict with each other, be it militarily, be it economically, be it politically, be it any other front, they will be in conflict. And that is why it is very, very important to have bilateral mechanisms to curb the use of nuclear weapon in the very first place, right? Because even right now we are seeing in the various conflicts around the world, such as Russia-Ukraine crisis. Russia has time and again warned that it will be not shying away from using nuclear weapons against Ukraine and the NATO allies. So that is what we have to understand. The countries themselves need bilateral mechanisms. Next, the nuclear weapons spread should be curbed, particularly through reduction in spread of technology, through control the resources that actually lead to the production of nuclear weapons, such as the uranium, thorium, and supply chain of this kind of materials. Next, in 1963, after the world was actually very cautious about this nuclear conflict, right? In 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was actually ratified and signed. Now here let me tell you, India was not a part of the same, because India thought, in that period of time, such as USSR and US, they already have nuclear weapons and they already have this deterrence against, say, potential future attacks of nuclear weapons. And also various countries such as France and the other Western nations, they were also developing on their nuclear technologies. So India thought back then that if we became a party to this Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was actually a treaty to ban the testing of nuclear weapons, because the testing of nuclear weapons is actually a stage of development of nuclear weapons by a particular nation. So India did not ratify to the same, because in our neighborhood we have China, we have Pakistan, right? And we have had back then various regional issues surrounding India. So India actually did not overboard this PTBT back then, due to its own domestic concerns, and also due to, say, particular future aspirations of India to actually develop her own nuclear weapons. Next, in 1968, this PTBT was actually strengthened, and another treaty was actually signed by the name of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is popularly also known as NPT. Now NPT, India did not also sign here, because again India's concerns were same. We had regional issues. We had these mega powers of USSR and the US having nuclear weapons. We needed to have our own deterrence. So that is why India did not sign the same, and India actually did something more. India actually conducted this nuclear test, the very first nuclear test, which was known as Smiling Buddha. It was carried out in 1974, and the entire global community, particularly the developed countries, were actually very cautious of India as of now, because as of now, as of 1960s and 70s, the main temperament of the global nuclear order was that nuclear weapons is a kind of a sophisticated technology that could only be possible with the, say, developed nations. But here right now, a developing nation is also carrying out her own nuclear test, and here we have to understand this is a very big significant event that took place. Actually, this triggered countries such as USSR, UK, Canada, France, Japan, and West Germany back then to actually form an exclusive group which would actually supply the various raw materials, the distributions of nuclear technology around the entire world. Now this was known as the London Club initially. This would later, and right now, the same name is also continued as the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So Nuclear Suppliers Group was indirectly was formed as one of the responses to India's own testing of nuclear weapons, because simply the fact that India wanted to have her own nuclear deterrence, which the Western nations were not happy with. So India did actually a very Atmanirbhar kind of a task, a self-reliant task, because India's own defense imperatives were also important back then, and even is very important right now. Now here in 1996, another very comprehensive nuclear treaty was also signed, known as Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Now the main objective of this particular treaty was actually banning all nuclear explosions for civilian and military purposes, right? It was adopted in 1996, and right now, even when we talk about the particular, say, ratification or say the signing of various countries onto this particular treaty, it is still pending as of now, because it requires ratification by 44 specific countries, and particularly the nations which have nuclear weapons. As we have also seen in the very first slide, there are around 8-9 countries which have nuclear weapons in the world as of now. Now all of those countries must be a signatory to this CTBT, and then only this particular treaty will be coming into place. But including India and other 7-8 nuclear states, it did not become a part of this treaty. Now, the main significance of this treaty is that this will be preventing any kind of further nuclear, proliferation, because it is totally banning any nuclear explosions for any test or any for civilian or military purposes, right? And here we have to understand India's position as of now, that India did not even sign, did not even ratify the same. And this is actually because India sees this treaty as discriminatory, because here this treaty is actually talking to actually ban the testing of nuclear weapons, that is, say, not to develop further nuclear weapons. But what about US? What about China? What about, say, Russia, who already have a stockpile of nuclear weapons capable of destroying enough of the entire world? Right? So India has nuclear arsenals in the range of 160s, 70s and 80s. Now US has more than 1,000 warheads. So here, this is actually seen as a temporary ban to this particular nuclear development. So this is actually discriminatory, because the countries who have already developed nuclear weapons in the past, they will be having advantages of the same. Next, the latest treaty that we have is actually known as the United Nations Treaty, which was actually signed by the United Nations. It is actually the United Nations Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And in this particular treaty, the main objective is actually much more strict now. It is not talking about tests or development. It is actually talking about complete ban. And this ban will be legally binding on all of the nations who will be actually a part of the treaty. It was actually adopted in 2017, finally ratified it was entered into force in 2021, and the main significance is that it is the only first legally binding treaty, international treaty, which will totally banning the nuclear weapons. But the main position we have to understand, the main nations, nuclear wastage such as US, Russia and so on, China, even India, they did not sign the same. And without these countries, we cannot even tell that this treaty is a success. As we can see here, only the countries which are signed, which are showed here in, say, dark blue, they have signed here and they have ratified. But most of the world, and if you can see, most of the Western nations, even Russia and India, China, North Korea and all of the other nuclear nations, they did not even sign the same. Right? Now here, we have to understand the world is changing as of now. And this is also coming on the tracks, on the heels of Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France. He recently stated that the world will be soon having an apocalypse because of the pending nuclear war and the, say, various warmongering that is going on in the geopolitical circles. Because right now, particularly nations like China and Russia, they are not shying away from using the N word, which is a nuclear word. And that is what we have to understand, that the world right now is on the brink of collapse, because countries right now see nuclear, or say going nuclear, as a very, very common trend. Because we have to understand, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, these nuclear tensions kind of decreased, and even say early 2000 onwards, or say even in 2010 onwards, we did not even saw the, say, proliferation, or say the use of this nuclear weapons and this nuclear wars in the common media circles. But right now we are seeing, on the heels of various global conflicts which are taking place all around the world, right, this is particularly a thing which is actually promoting on and on by various global leaders. Next, we have to also understand, recently Russia also revoked its support from the CTBT, and this is also a signal kind of that the Russia is not actually on board with the normal nuclear conventions. Next, China's nuclear advancements is also kind of increasing at a breakneck speed. China is fitting nuclear weapons into various aerial and marine vehicles. It is also, we have to understand, we are living in the time of a polycrisis. Now, polycrisis is a very, very important word. We can use this word in your essays, in your ethics, in your answers. This is actually referring to a particular crisis, right, or say a particular state of our world, in which we are surrounded by various conflicts, such as the climate change, such as Russia-Ukraine, such as Hamas, attack in Israel and vice versa. We have conflicts in Africa, we have conflicts in Azerbaijan, we have conflicts everywhere, right? So we are actually living in a world surrounding by conflicts on the climate front, on the cyber front, on the various military fronts and as well. And here, we have to take some lessons from the US-India civil nuclear deal, which is also quoted in this editorial, because this nuclear deal is actually a testament to the resilience that the international countries can show each other, particularly towards very international serious issues, particularly when we talk about nuclear weapons. Now in this deal, it was actually agreed back in 1970s that the Western nations would not help India at all when it came to nuclear weapons. But in 2008, right, the US and also some other like-minded nations such as France and Japan, they tried to renegotiate with India, particularly when we talk about using nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So here this nuclear peace deal was actually signed. This was known as civil nuclear deal, and India's position in the global nuclear order was actually changed as as of now. Now here we understood that India so far, it's still now not a member of the CTBT or NPT, or even not a member of the nuclear supplies group. But here an exception for India was actually made under specific safeguards agreement, right, which was actually developed by and also implemented by International Atomic Energy Agency, which is actually located at Vienna, and this agency is looking for the peaceful development of nuclear energy. Now this particular safeguards agreement is actually very significant for India and the rest of the world, because it is facilitating civil nuclear cooperation with other nations, and also the exchange of various technologies when it comes to the various nuclear reactors and also the potential nuclear reactors India will be building with foreign support and foreign technology in India. So here India agreed to place around 14 nuclear civil nuclear reactors under IAEA safeguards, that is arranging or adhering to international safety norms for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And finally, we have to understand there is a need as of now to develop effective leadership in the global nuclear discourse, because right now it is seeming that the global leaders are not shying away from using this nuclear word or using the nuclear conflict as a context to attack or invade other nations. And also we have to understand we are living in an age of extremes, and that is why we have to understand the deterrence, the hold, the patience that we should be having in international discourses in various conflicts is of immense importance, because if even one nuclear bomb goes off in any one country, it will be leading to cascading of various destruction around the world. And that is what this is a very important topic. You can use these references in your answers. In the next one, we'll be looking into the various interlinkages between inflation, trade, and the two of them in Indian agriculture. This is a very beautiful kind of an editorial written by two important agricultural economists, Ashok Gulati and Ritika Juneja. You can quote them in your answers, because these will be adding various value additions, and also these two authors have time and again collaborated in the past on Indian Express editorials and opinion pages to actually contribute and give you very important value additive points for your exam. For prelims, we need to look at it to the lens of Indian agriculture, because we have economic and social development. In GST, we also have issues related to direct and indirect farms subsidies and minimum support prices. Now here, when we talk about the amount of inflation, trade and its relation with Indian agriculture, we have to first discuss some important things. And these things will be regarding the Reserve Bank of India, because we know that the Reserve Bank of India is India's own central bank, and one of the major roles of Reserve Bank, or any central bank across the world, it is actually to maintain economic stability. And one of the ways through which central banks maintain economic stability is actually controlling the money supply in their own nations. Now we have to understand here also, in our country, RBI is interested with controlling the consumer price inflation, or the inflation which is taking place at the retail markets, or inflation in general in India. Because you have to understand that inflation, or the persistent general rise in prices of a particular set of or basket of goods and services over a particular period of time, can be particularly harmful for the economic growth of the nation, because inflation and too much of inflation is actually decreasing the value of your money, and also the value of the various goods and services, and also GDP over a long period of time. These are actually the negative consequences of inflation. And particularly when we look at the consumers and the farmers and the producers of various goods and services, inflation can be very costly for them, because simply inflation means rise in prices, right? So it will be making the things more and more costly, more and more unaffordable for the general consumer, general producer, general farmers. Now here in our country, RBI is actually having this mandate to have this inflation control between 4 plus minus 2 percentages. That means that in India, according to the RBI Act, the central government in consultation with the RBI has actually will be actually framing a target for maintaining inflation in the country in the range of 2% to a maximum of 6% in the country, and this target will be revised every 5 years. And here the authors are actually telling that as of now, overall inflation in the country has been successfully managed to be under, say, 6%. And here also, as we can see here, from the latest April 2024 CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is actually released by the NSO, we find that the overall inflation is just around at 4.7 percentages. But when we look at the various sub-components, such as the cereals and products, meat and fish, and also the food and beverages, and also the various other commodities such as fruits, milk, oil, pulses, sugar, and so on, we find that the inflation in food items is actually almost an average of 8%, and this is actually much more higher than the target of this RBI. Now you have to understand, when we talk about this particular target of this particular central bank of our country, we have to understand that this target is very strictly strictly followed, and we have to also understand that recently RBI generated around rupees 2.11 trillion as a surplus, and it gave the same to the government of India. This is also known as the economic capital framework of the RBI, right? So we have to understand that RBI on its front has managed to keep overall inflation at, say, below 6%, but this food inflation has breached RBI's inflation targets. And also, as of now, RBI also has helped the government by contributing some of the extra surpluses to the government. But there are some challenges here, particularly we have seen due to the high food inflation, right? Next, also we have to understand RBI's coordination with the government to adjust various trade policies, right? We have to also understand that this is also one of the steps that RBI has taken in the recent years, right? Because when we talk about the agricultural imports, which we'll be seeing in the next slide, we have to understand that the imports, right, in itself can influence the inflation price here. And here we are talking something about imported inflation, right? For example, if we impose higher amount of tariffs, if, say, for example, some other nations, right, for example, the countries which actually supply us edible oil or pulses, they already have inflation in their nations. So that inflation will be imported in our nation too. So here we have to understand that in recent times, RBI has actually taken some steps to curb this kind of trade issues. Next, also RBI has collaborated with the government to actually bring across efficiency in the market, particularly via controlling prices in the essential commodities. Now here we'll be actually looking at the overall details of the same here. Now here we see, when we have a look at the composition of the overall agricultural imports, we see that the almost 45% of our imports is due to the import of vegetable oil, right? Then it is followed by, say, pulses, right, and various other items such as sugar, spices, cashews, and so on. Even we find that natural rubber is actually a major imported good in India. And if we see, right, this is actually the basket of composition, and the total agri export is around at $32 billion. Now, if you look at the trend, right, in the last 5-6 years and also the last 20 years, particularly under various governments, we see, right, from 2004 to around 2014, right, so agricultural import, right, was actually very low. But right now, if you can see here, the agricultural imports over a period of time, they have increased. But if you look at the last 2-3 years, around the last 2-3 years, the agricultural import has actually decreased. Okay, now this is actually signaling, and here the authors have also observed that we have seen an overall decline in the agricultural imports by the country. And if you can see here, agricultural imports fell by 8% in this particular financial year, and also this is mainly due to the decrease in the value of edible oil imports, because as we can see, this is actually the biggest component of the same. And if vegetable oil imports decrease, automatically we will be seeing a decrease in the same. So in no way it is telling that across all the commodities we saw a decline. We mainly saw a decline due to edible oil import decline. Also, Indian imports of agri commodities, especially when we talk about pulses, right, they increased over a period of time. Pulses actually doubled in value, or say the import value doubled from around say $1.9 billion in the last financial year to $3.7 billion in this particular financial year. And we have also understand this is actually mainly of two reasons. Firstly, because the domestic production of pulses is not say increasing over a period of time. We have to understand India is actually majorly dependent on imports when we talk about the pulses, because the domestic conditions on the production side of the pulses is not healthy. Next, we also have seen high amount of pulses inflation in the nation too. Right now, here when we talk about the trade policies, right, or the implications of the trade, say tariff, custom duties, export duties and so on, and their implications on the final prices, we have to take the example of pulses again. Now actually back in 2015-16, we have to understand the government of India actually imposed heavy amount of import duties on the pulses. Right now we have to understand that here on the same side, the domestic production of pulses was also increasing, right? So that is why over a period of time, say over a period of 1 year, the government actually decreased the import duties on pulses, because obviously there are enough say domestic production of the same, right? And here we have to understand, because of the decrease in the duties on the pulses, it has been seen in many of the years, it has been found out that for the domestic production of pulses, MSP, right, minimum support price is given to the farmers for the pulses. And here it has been seen that the MSPs were actually the minimum price that the government or say the farmer should be receiving for the pulses. But due to the reduction of the farm say the export duties, right, or say the external duties on the pulses, it was seen that the domestic prices of the pulses actually came far down, because there were more cheaper imports of pulses, further say bringing down the prices of pulses in the market down. And this was actually much more say lower than the MSP prices, and this is what is also a very important reason. That is why we have to actually calibrate or adjust our trade policies with the MSP also, because MSP is a minimum support price that the farmer should be guaranteed. And if the prices in the market are going below MSP, that means that there are some external issues such as trade issues which are hampering the same, and that is why we have to abide by this same. Now here the authors have given generally some recommendations toward the same, and you can also use this in your mains answers. You can use these answers with respect to any agricultural production question, or say agri export question, or any of the questions that also pertains to the MSP side. You can you can actually incorporate these points, such as the very first is actually integrated trade policy with MSP. So the government must not be solely giving MSP to the farmers. They should be also integrating the overall market effects, such as the trade issues, right, with respect to the MSP, right? That is because the government have to ensure the prices above the MSP to the farmer, because otherwise the farmers will be staring at losses. Next, the calibrated import duties must also be awarded to the particular farmers, right? Now here the import duties must be calibrated so that it must not be bringing down the MSPs. Right. Next, also when we talk about the agricultural imports, large section of the same is actually attributed to the vegetable oil part. So here the edible oil policy must be strengthening and be made more strategic. In the same, we have to understand, we have to balance imports and domestic production. And when we talk about the same, right, we have to talk about this particular national mission on edible oils, oil palm, right. This is actually a particular government of India initiative which has around 11,000 crore in its corpus, and this will be the main focus is actually to increase the area productivity and the very diversity of oil seeds and palm oil in the country. Right, the special focus will be on the northeast and the Andaman and Nicobar Island, because these are the particular areas which is suitable for palm oil cultivation, right? And here we have to understand, if India is actually promoting more and more domestic production of oil seeds and the vegetable oil components, this India can become self-reliant, Atmanirbhar on the agricultural import side. And that is why we have to understand these are all the issues and the policies measures that the government must be taking care of. In the next one, we'll be looking at the very first commercialization of LVM3 commercialization of the satellite launch vehicle by ISRO. And this is a very, very big news and a very, very big development for the private sector development in India's space operations. A very, very important topic for UPSC prelims, where we have to look at general science, and also for GST, where we have to look at indigenization in technology by Indians. And here we have to first start with actually what is actually launch vehicle Mark III, or this was actually previously known as GSLV MK or say Mark III. So this LVM3 rocket will be actually used in Gaganyaan mission, which is actually India's first space crewed mission, right? And here we have to understand this is India's heaviest rocket and the most powerful rocket so far, because this is actually fueled by 3 stages. The very first stage is actually containing of a liquid stage, right, where we have L110 liquid stage. It is followed by the second stage, which is actually propelled by 2 solid S200 boosters. The third stage is actually a cryogenic stage, which is actually derived from liquid oxygen, hydrogen, and this is actually taken care by C-25 thrusters. Now this rocket is very, very significant. Why? Because it can now simply take heavier payloads such as heavy duty satellites and even crewed missions such as our own Gaganyaan mission. And here we can look at it here that these heavier payloads can now be sent to as far as geostationary Earth orbit. As we already know that depending on the distance from the Earth, we have various orbits, right? So here this is actually the geostationary Earth orbit, which is actually situated more than 40,000 kilometers from the Earth's surface. And also we can see here in this particular map here, this is one stop map where we can actually see the overall operations of the various important and sensitive satellites in the particular Indian space and also the outer space, right? As we can see, a Hubble telescope is actually situated here. International Space Station is here. We have the GPS operations at this particular point, right? We also have GLONASS, which is also a kind of a GPS satellite. So we can understand that in here we have this particular rocket which has the capability to send any particular payload to this particular orbit. Now here recently we have to understand this is actually on heels of ISRO's recent efforts to commercialize ISRO's operations. And it did not start in 2024 itself. It actually started way back in 1969, when back then the public sector enterprises and the private companies were actually collaborating with the ISRO, which actually was used to launch various auxiliary space components such as small satellites, weather observation units, and so on. But a major boost was given in 1992 when the Department of Space, right, which is directly under the Prime Minister of India, right, and is actually also closely aligned with the Space Commission. It actually gave birth to Antrix Corporation Limited. Now Antrix is actually ISRO's commercial arms, which is actually looking towards the launch of various foreign satellites on Indian soil, right? Now here this got a major boost in 2016 because the PSLV C-37 launch vehicle actually launched more than 100 satellites into the space, right? Also in 2019, NSIL, or New Space India Limited, was also established. Now New Space India Limited is actually commissioned to envisage building the capacity of local industries in India for local manufacturing of the various space components. Now further, InSpace was conceptualized, right, recently in the last 5 years to actually act as a single window clearance platform for all the non-government entities, particularly the private companies, to do business in space operations in country, particularly via ISRO sharing knowledge of various satellites, various space operations with the private companies, and they will be in a position to become India's next SpaceX, which is actually the world's one of the major private space companies when we talk about the space sector. So Indian government is also trying to promote the same, and here InSpace will be the nodal agency towards the same. And here let us not have the confusion between Antrix, NSIL and InSpace. let me repeat again, Antrix is actually to promote India's or say ISRO's commercial operations, particularly to attract foreign satellites to launch on India's soil, right? We also have NSIL, which is actually looking at boosting the capabilities of India's domestic sector. And finally, we have InSpace, which is actually looking at NGEs or say non-government entities to start up the space sector in the country. And here, ISRO has right now opened the door to private firms to build this particular rocket. And here this collaboration is extremely important because it is increasing the private participation, because right now more and more startups, more MSMEs, they can actually think of participating in India's space sector, which is actually going forward 20, 50, 100 years from now will be actually the main sector. And actually when we talk about future space operations, when we talk about excavations towards various asteroids, meteors and so on, space sector will be a very, very important one, and we are starting with the same here. It will be also enhancing the global competitiveness of India's space sector exports, right? Next, it will be also giving competitive edge to the various competitive programs such as Ariane of European Unions, right? And also the geopolitical tensions in which Russia is also embroiled. So it is also giving alternative to Russia to also use India's imperatives in this manner. Next, it is also focusing on the future endeavors, where you have to understand India is also looking at, building around 4 to 6 LMV3s rocket annually within 12 years. So here we have to understand that despite there will be some challenges of say cost, building enterprises in India, the giving particular bank capital to the particular companies, but here we have to also look at the considerations going forward. ISRO must be successfully transferring this kind of technologies to the private sector, and this has to be centralized and this has to be facilitated from ISRO sides. And apart from this, India has also taken many initiatives recently, right? It is also aiming to become a global technology powerhouse in the near future. And please do use these words in your mains answers to actually enhance the value of your answer, right? Next, it has recently, as I've already mentioned and highlighted, that it has launched this InSpace, NSIL, and also allowing ISRO to focus more and more R&D or say research and development activities, because ISRO's main development should be on research and not on commercial operations, which will be taken by the private sector. In the next one, we'll be looking at the European Union's AI, Artificial Intelligence Convention, because recently the Council of Europe adopted the Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law. A very long name, I know, but you don't have to remember the same. Just remember the same via AI Convention. It's a very important part of the syllabus of general science. GS2, where we have to look at the policies and politics of the developing countries on India's interest, because AI right now is an international discourse. And finally GS3, where we have to look at the awareness in the fields of IT and computers. Now this is a particular convention which will be legally binding. This will be signed in Lithuania in September 2024. That is, it has not been yet ratified and signed. So it will be actually a legally binding one. And actually when it comes to conventions and protocols, we have to understand conventions are this kind of happenings in international events where a large amount of expertise is needed on a particular area such as climate change, artificial intelligence and so on. And further, under these conventions we have various sub-rules, sub-protocols. So we have conventions and we will be having protocol within the same. So this AI convention will be having further AI protocols when it will be finally agreed to the same. The main aim is actually to regulate the AI development in the same, and finally also give definition to AI on the heels of the EU AI Act and also the OECD AI's definition, right? Now here the main scope is actually to promote human rights, democracy and the rule of law, because AI has disruptive capabilities to actually not conform to normal human standards. So it is actually an endeavor to bring a convention to regulate the development of AI to actually make it more human friendly. And here the public and the private sector responsibilities have also been highlighted, and here the inclusion of the private sector in this particular convention is also special, because mainly in international conventions we have seen it will be generally mainly international organizations or the countries which will be a part of the convention. But here here for the very first time, right, in this technology convention, private companies have also, brought as in a part in this same, because Microsoft, OpenAI, right? Then we have Apple, we have various private companies which are spending a lot on AI development, and these are actually the companies which are funding the AI development and so on. The governments are not. Government should be making the rules. That is where the private sector has also be bought in the same, right? And here, there will be some exemptions for national interest. For example, based on national security interest, research, development, national defense, this convention will be actually having some exemptions, right? Now, the main observation from this actually convention is that there is no new AI specific rights, right? This is actually a kind of a demotivated dampening effect of this convention. Next, it is highlighting the government obligation. This is actually good. And finally, this will be also telling the government that government is actually finally binding on this particular legally binding agreement. Next, comprehensive approach to mitigate risk will be also there. There will be a graded kind of risk depending on the lower risk to the higher risk based on a particular graded technique, right? Finally, the regional influence will also be there because this convention will be requiring the countries to frame legislations or say national legislations. So, for example, if India is a part of this convention, India has to come up with national laws for AI regulation in the same. Next, the risk and innovation frontier will also be tackled here because the private companies are backed in this particular convention and the government is also on the same portal here. So, the kind of innovation that the private companies are doing on this AI front, they have to be regulated, they have to be checked that it should not be becoming very dangerous or say too much disruptive to totally say take away people's job. And when we look at AI regulations all around the world, we have the US, EU, Canada and UK who are having, in particular, say legislations via various conventions, their own national guidelines on AI. And here, it is the European Union who is having this AI Act, which is kind of a very progressive AI Act. And here, the overall global community is also trying to emulate the same. In the next one, we'll be looking at PM JANMAN scheme because this editorial is talking on this particular scheme and some of the defects of the scheme too. Now here, for Indian polity and also for the various welfare schemes and policies for the vulnerable sections, we have to look at the same. Now, this particular scheme is actually known as Pradhan Mantri Janjati Adivasi Nyay Maha Abhiyan. Now, when we are talking about Maha Abhiyan, this is actually the main scheme which is targeting the PVTG or particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And here we can see here there are total of 75 PVTGs spread around Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar and Jharkhand. And it is very, very important that you should be looking at this map and the various tribal say names here given in the list, right? Because this has actually appeared in the PYQs. And for this, I will be providing this in the handout. So please do check the handout in the description for the overall map and keep the map safe with you. So this main scheme is an Maha scheme to actually facilitate say development of houses, tap drinking water, then electricity connections, multi-purpose storage, constructing roads, constructing various other facilities here as we can see, right? So more than understand here that here this will be benefiting more than 22 lakh people who are actually belonging to these sections of the population, right? So there will be 11 critical interventions as we can see here, right? For say pakka house, road connectivity, pipe water supply and so on, because the tribal sections of the population, they are primarily deprived of this kind of facilities. So this will be a mega scheme which will be proposed by which will be actually implemented by the Indian government to cater to this particular population classes. And here when we talk about this particular editorial, it is talking about this housing challenge because the housing component, which is a sub-component of the scheme, which will be guaranteeing pakka houses to the tribal sections. Here this is actually the biggest direct benefit transfer component of this scheme. And here we can understand the government have this target of reaching out to around 5 lakh PVTG households by 2026, right? And here the people will be given around 2.39 lakh rupees in 3 installments to actually build a pakka house. But here the main aspect here is with reference to data collection, because we find that the many tribal sections, their own existence, their own property rights, land rights are not recorded properly. And here we have to understand This is one of the issues here. When we talk about the data collection, we have to also talk about a very important feature of this particular scheme, which is known as Awas Plus mobile application, as you can see here. Now, this is the application which will be there with the government officials. They will be actually looking into the various track records of this particular housing scheme under this scheme. Right, so they have to go for inspection, they have to go for various kind of surveys, geographical identification and so on. So that is where this particular app is also not functioning well, and also this app is posing issues to the tribal populations because of non-registration, non-availability of Aadhaar card, biometric data and so on. Next, we have to also understand that Manrega job card is also a very, very important and one of the most crucial aspect of this particular scheme. Now, many tribal populations do not have a particular Manrega card. So that is where these people are also being excluded. Now, under bank options, but in this particular housing scheme of this PM JANMAN, there are around more than 500 banks, cooperative banks and so on. But there is this exclusion of this Indian postal payment banks, which is actually the most popular banks with the tribal sections of the population. And here we have to understand that this particular portal needs to integrate all the important banks, especially these postal banks which are tribal operate. And here we can see here, this is actually a scheme which is not implemented by one ministry. It is actually implemented by Ministry of Tribal Affairs, Health and Family Welfare, Power, Women and Child Development, New and Renewable Energy, Rural Development, Education, Jal Shakti, and finally telecommunication. So, a large number of ministries are actually working in convergence, and sometimes there have been issues in this convergence also. So, there has to be particular amount of convergence, harmonious action between these departments and the ministries of the government too. Finally, we'll be going through 4 important prelim snippets. In the first one, we'll be looking at digital public goods. These are simple goods such as eKYC, IMPS, or the facility on which also we use this UPI, United Payment Interface, Bharat QR, Aadhaar Pay. So all of these are actually public goods because they are actually being facilitated by the government of the day, and we also have our own data on the same. And here, these are the goods which are existing entirely on the digital portal. So that is why digital public goods are openly accessible resources that can be freely used and shared to improve the public services. They can take the form of open software, datasets, or digital platforms. The most popular Indian initiatives in digital public goods as of now, as we can see, is Aadhaar ecosystem. When we talk about open source, we obviously do not mean that our Aadhaar card details are available to everyone. We mean that these particular details are available to only us, and only some of our selected details such as our name and address can be used by the government to actually maybe to target us as beneficiaries for particular government schemes, policies and so on. We also have this Diksha portal to catering the educational needs based on this open source digital platform, which is actually disseminating educational services mainly to the disadvantaged sections of the population. And finally, we have this government APIs, particularly the news is about CoWIN portal, which was actually used by not only India but also many of our neighboring countries and also many other countries around the world to facilitate the distribution of COVID vaccine to their target population. So these are the main trademark Indian government digital public goods. The next one will be looking about the Competition Commission of India. This was established under the Competition Act of 2002, and this was after replacing the Monopolies and Trade Restrictive Practices Act of 1969. Now, the main function of the same is investigating anti-competitive measures, because we have to understand in India there can be many big sellers, there can be many retailers. So the competition, the power, resources must be the same between them, and that is why this CCI is there to investigate any anti-competitive agreements or cartels forming out to actually totally wash out competition and bring monopoly. So monopoly is not desired in Indian markets, and that is why there must be more and more competition, more and more space for the private sector. They will be also regulating mergers and consolidations and acquisitions of private companies, right? They will be adjudicating cases into abuse of dominant position, which is actually a phenomena when a company abuses its major position mainly due to economic and finances position to actually influence the market conditions. Next, it can also issue cease and desist order, right, and also impose penalties on companies when it is actually violating this kind of competitive policies. When we talk about composition, it is actually a quasi-judicial body with a chairperson and a maximum of 10 members appointed by the central government. And the next one, we'll be looking into the major stock exchanges of the country, because here in this particular article we have looked into the various basics of the same. And here Sensex, which is actually under this Bombay Securities Exchange, BSE, is the oldest exchange in the country. It was formed in 1996 and based on 30 important and most tracked stocks in the country, right? When we talk about the Nifty, it looks into the top 50 stocks in the country. It was established in 1995. And which companies are actually selected in Sensex? It is actually looking into the various companies which are trying to list or say become a part of the stock exchange. So biannually in June and December, Sensex will be reconstituting, and in this particular time period, some companies can actually file their listing to the same, right? The listing history of these companies must be minimum of 6 months at BSE, right? Then the stocks must be also having a derivative contract. Now this derivative contract, that means it must be having some underlying asset backing this particular stock, share and so on, right? So this must be also same. Finally, the company must be among the top 75 companies in this particular Sensex, right? Now we have to understand the main differences between Nifty and Sensex here, right? When we talk about the most important differences for our prelims examination, Nifty is owned by National Stock Exchange, it is owned by the Bombay Stock Exchange, right? Sensex is consisted of 30 stocks, it is consisted of 50 top performing stocks, right? And finally, the base year of Sensex is 1978-79 and here it is 1995. Finally, we come to the last one where we have to look into the various concepts and facts of NGT, National Green Tribunal. It was established, it is actually a statutory body established under the NGT Act of 2010. The main aim is actually to bring effective and expeditious disposal of cases pertaining to the environmental aspects. The tribunal comprises of a chairperson appointed by the central government in consultation with the Chief Justice of India. Judicial members will be there and expert members mainly to the environmental field. They will be handling all the civil cases with substantial questions related to environment, right? And they have been formed to reduce the burden on the high courts and supreme courts, particularly bringing the cases on environment on their manner, and mainly they will be enforcing various environmental laws in the country, right? And finally, they will be also have this option of taking suo motu action against the people who are violating environmental laws in the country, right? The disposal of the cases must be taking place within 6 months of filing, and they are not bound by the Code of Civil Procedure and works by the principle of natural justice. Now, I thank you all for being a part of this discussion, and please do attempt the quiz which is following up. All the best for the future endeavors till we meet again. Thank you.